Greetings Realm Lords, Core Bricks here, and today we're going to talk about terrain. Now if you've seen my other videos, you've seen that my game board has a bunch of different colored spaces on it. We've got green spaces, brown spaces, tan spaces, gray spaces, spaces on buildings, and the list goes on. Now these different spaces represent different terrain on the battlefield. For the most part, the individual colors don't matter too much. We don't have to keep track of whether or not we're walking on grass versus stone, for example. But there are three overarching types of terrain that we do need to know and understand to play core. So the first of these is what I have around me, and this is normal terrain. Normal terrain includes grass, dirt, stone, scorched earth, sand, and any terrain that is on a building, or what we call structural terrain. All that falls under the umbrella of normal. You can always tell you're on normal terrain because the terrain base will be a different color from the 2x2 plate at the center of each space. Normal terrain sometimes is a mix of two different terrains. So very frequently we'll have like grass and dirt combined, or we'll have maybe sand and grass combined, or scorched earth and dirt combined. But anytime you've got a mix of colors going on a space, then you've got normal terrain. Normal terrain, there's nothing special about it. If you watched my previous video on spaces and my video about stats, you move around normal terrain exactly as I explained in those videos. Our next terrain type is hindering terrain. Now, hindering terrain sticks out because hindering terrain has the same color between the terrain base and the 2x2 stud on top of it, or sometimes there is no 2x2 stud on top of it. Hindering terrain includes shallow water, snow, and desert terrain. The difference between desert terrain and sand terrain is that desert will a tan terrain base and a tan 2x2 on top of it. Sand terrain will always be combined with a different terrain type, so that you can very clearly see the difference between desert terrain and sand terrain. Desert terrain is basically exclusively found in Tordrim on my board. That's our desert area, and snow terrain is basically exclusively found in Legna on our board, where our snowy area is. But shallow water wraps around the entire board completely. So how does hindering terrain work? If your unit is on hindering terrain, if they start their turn on hindering terrain, they end their turn on hindering terrain, or they ever enter hindering terrain at all while they are moving, then their movement for that unit command is reduced by 2. This is an immediate effect. So if a unit wants to enter hindering terrain, we're going to immediately reduce their movement by 2 for that unit command. If that reduces their movement such that they can no longer enter that hindering terrain, then they cannot step into the hindering terrain during their unit command. So if we take a look at our Kingdom Archer here, he normally has a movement of 3, but now that he is walking in shallow water, he can only move 1 space. Snow and desert terrain are a little bit more interesting because they are only hindering terrain half the time on the game board. Snow, for example, is only hindering terrain when it is nighttime, when those frigid temperatures kick in and your units really don't want to move around. During the day, snow functions like normal terrain. So if we look at our Kingdom Archer, he can move 1, 2, 3 spaces in his turn if it's daytime. But if we turn out the lights, if it is a nighttime turn, then he can only move 1 single space. Keep in mind, this applies even if he doesn't start his turn in the snow. So if we start him on this little piece of stone here and we move him into the snow, he's going to have to immediately end his turn because his movement was reduced by 2 for entering the snow. On the flip side, if we turn our attention over to desert terrain, it is during the day that desert terrain is hindering terrain. So if Prince Jalen wants to move through the desert to attack this Shadow Conscript, if he tries to do it during the day, his movement, which is normally 4, is going to actually be reduced to 2, and he's not going to be able to make it to that Shadow Conscript. But if Jalen is taking his turn at night it's a little bit cooler in the desert, and desert functions like normal terrain. So if he's going at night, he can move all the way up to that Shadow Conscript and perform his attack. So this adds another element to that day-night mechanic in my game. There's another reason to keep track of day and night. It doesn't just matter for combat, it also matters for moving around in Legna and Tordrim, where you're probably going to be moving on snow and desert terrain. It's worth noting that there are some units who ignore the penalties of shallow water, the penalties of desert, the penalties of ice. It depends on the unit, but different units have abilities that get around these things. And so those units become extra valuable in these different terrain types. Hey my friends, also don't forget 2 things. You can always find all these rules at www.circleofrealms.com. And hey, if you're enjoying this video, if you'd like to learn more about the Circle of Realms or my particular rule set that I've used to make my Lego game, then please like and subscribe for more content. The only thing worse than hindering terrain for a unit is hazardous terrain. There are 2 types of hazardous terrain in the Circle of Realms. There is deep water, and there is, of course, lava. Hazardous terrain has no center 2x2 stud on it, and hazardous terrain can only be entered by units that have abilities that allow them to enter hazardous terrain. So for example, if a unit wants to enter deep water, then they need to have the ability to swim like our Hawk Knights do. Now, unfortunately, sometimes units find themselves in hazardous terrain, even though they didn't want to be there. Maybe another unit picked up and threw your unit into lava. Or maybe your unit was already standing on lava with fire resistance, and then they lost that fire resistance ability while they were on lava. That's certainly a possibility, especially if your team is getting that bonus from being in an alliance with another player. If this happens to your unit, like say you are this Kingdom Archer and you got stuck on lava even though you didn't want to be on it, then bam, that unit dies immediately. Our Kingdom Archer gets incinerated. Deep water is really no better. Say our Monkey Knight ended up getting stuck in deep water, that unit is going to drown immediately. So essentially, hazardous terrain is a type of terrain that instantly kills units that are on it. Do keep in mind what I said though, a unit cannot willingly walk itself into hazardous terrain if it will kill them. They can only enter hazardous terrain if they've got an ability that allows them to do so. In order to actually be killed by hazardous terrain, they need to be pushed into it, or maybe they're on a ship that sinks, or for some reason they lose their ability that gives them resistance. In any event, anything like this will get the unit killed. Sometimes units have the ability to enter hazardous terrain. Typically when they have this ability, they treat it like hindering terrains. They still have to move very slowly through hazardous terrain, but they can at least enter it. And something to keep in mind is that units that are on hazardous terrain, even if they can enter it, they cannot use ranged attacks while they are on hazardous terrain. They can only attack units that are one space away from them. And that is because they're using their limbs to stay afloat or kind of find leverage while they are navigating that hazardous terrain. Those are our 3 terrain types. Just a couple notes I want to make, or addendums I'd like to add at the very end here. Like I said in my last video, there are some large units in the Circle of Realms. If a unit is on multiple spaces at the same time, then they are on multiple terrain types at the same time if those spaces are different terrain. Essentially, if your unit is on the space, then they are on that terrain type. Something else to keep in mind, we talked about abilities that allow you to enter hindering and hazardous terrain without penalty. There are also some abilities that grant units perks or disadvantages if they are on certain terrains. And this can be down to like if they're standing on grass or standing on dirt. It's not just hazardous versus normal. These abilities can apply just to the straight up different colors you'll see on the map. A few units have abilities about them being on structural terrain. Structural terrain is any terrain that is on a building or ship. It's basically man-made terrain like wood, carved stone, anything like that. When you build a building, any part of the physical structure is structural terrain, but most buildings do have a terrain base around them that they sit on. If there are spaces on that terrain base, then the spaces are considered whatever terrain color that terrain is on the battlefield. Other than that, I think that's all I have to say about spaces. They aren't a very heavy topic, especially if you already know how to move and handle all the nitty-gritty of the rules. My next video, or maybe my next 2 videos, are going to look at combat in the Circle of Realms, so you can see what that final attack phase looks like in a turn. And then after that, we'll return to the Cusped Kingdom and we'll start looking at more of their units and buildings. I didn't want to get too heavy into the rules. I just wanted us to get the basics down so that you understand what I'm talking about when I'm showing up all the stats and stuff like that for a unit. And then eventually we'll circle back to rules and we'll learn about how buildings work and items work and stuff like that. But in the meantime, my friends, be happy, be healthy, be well, and I'll see you next time here in the Circle of Realms.